The night she didn't come home, I told myself not to panic. My name is Robert Hale. I'm 66 years old, and I moved to Mexico City for a woman I believed I loved. 2 years later, I was standing in our apartment doorway holding her daughter's hand, trying to figure out how a man my age could feel this lost again. Before I tell you what happened, you need to understand the kind of man I was before I left the United States. I was steady, predictable. 41 years at the same utility company in Arizona. I married at 23, raised two children, paid off a mortgage, showed up on time, and never missed a payment. My wife, Linda, used to joke that I was built like one of those old pickup trucks that just keeps running because no one ever pushes it too hard. When she got sick, that steadiness didn't help much. Cancer doesn't care how reliable you are. I watched her shrink over 18 months. I learned how to cook the meals she could still swallow. I learned how to sit beside a hospital bed and pretend the machines weren't louder than my own heartbeat. When she passed, I was 59 and suddenly very alone in a house that understood her voice better than mine. Retirement followed a year later. The company gave me a plaque and a sheet cake. People shook my hand and said I'd earned the rest. I drove home at 2 in the afternoon and realized I didn't know what to do with a day that had no structure. My son called often at first. My daughter visited when she could. They had families, careers, real lives unfolding. I told them I was fine. I wasn't lying exactly. I could manage the bills, mow the lawn, make my own coffee, but evenings were long. Television filled space, not silence. It was a friend from church who suggested I try online dating. I laughed at him. At my age, I said. He shrugged and told me loneliness doesn't retire just because you do. That's how I met Elena. She was 30. I remember staring at that number on the screen longer than I want to admit. I almost closed the profile, but she had written first. Her message was simple. She said she liked older men because they were calm and serious, not impulsive. She said men her age were still figuring themselves out. I responded carefully. I told her I was old enough to be her father. She wrote back that sometimes fathers make the most dependable partners. We started talking every evening, video calls that stretched longer than I planned. She lived in Mexico City and worked in marketing. Her English was good, and when she stumbled, she laughed at herself instead of pretending she hadn't. She told me about the traffic, the street food, the way the city never really sleeps. I told her about the Arizona desert, the way sunsets stretch wide and quiet over flat land. After a week, she mentioned her daughter, Sophia, 6 years old. Big brown eyes, she said. Shy with strangers. I asked if it was appropriate for us to talk when she had a child. Elena said she wasn't looking for someone to replace Sophia's father. She just wanted someone stable in her own life. I didn't notice how that word worked on me. Stable. It made me feel useful again. Months passed. I built my days around our conversations. I'd finish dinner, clear the dishes, and sit at the kitchen table with my laptop like a teenager waiting for a call. Sometimes she'd angle the camera so I could see Sophia coloring at the table. Sophia would wave, but rarely speak. I would wave back, unsure what role I was playing. After 4 months, Elena suggested I visit. She said you can't understand someone fully through a screen. I booked a ticket before I had time to second-guess myself. Mexico City overwhelmed me in the first hour. The size of it, the movement, the noise that never quite settles. Elena met me at the airport with Sophia beside her. She looked smaller in person, more fragile than she appeared on camera. When she smiled, it felt like recognition, not surprise. Sophia hid behind her mother's leg at first. I crouched down and said hello in the little Spanish I practiced. She didn't respond. She just studied me with the careful look children use when they're measuring adults. The 2 weeks I spent there felt unreal. Elena took me everywhere. Parks filled with families, markets where fruit was stacked in bright pyramids, small cafes where the coffee tasted richer than anything I made at home. At night, we walked through neighborhoods that pulsed with life, music drifting from open windows. I found myself laughing more than I had in years. Sophia warmed to me slowly. On the 5th day, she sat beside me on a park bench and showed me a drawing she'd made of 3 stick figures holding hands. One was tall, one medium, one small. She pointed to the tallest and said, Roberto. That was the first time she used my name. When I returned to Arizona, the silence hit harder than before. The house felt staged, like it was waiting for a showing. Elena and I talked every day again. Now there was a new tone to it, a sense of future planning. She said she could see me there permanently. I told her I didn't speak the language well enough. She said I would learn. My children were cautious when I mentioned the idea. My daughter asked if I was thinking clearly. My son asked practical questions about visas and healthcare. I heard their concerns, but I also heard my own fear underneath everything. Fear that if I didn't act, I would settle into a life that felt smaller every year. 8 months after we first exchanged messages, I sold my house. I told myself I was choosing adventure over regret. I told myself that at 66, time mattered more than caution. The closing day came and went. I packed what fit into a few suitcases and wired the rest of my savings into an account I could access internationally. When I landed in Mexico City for the second time, it wasn't as a visitor. Elena hugged me longer at the airport. Sophia smiled without hiding. We moved into an apartment in Novarte. It wasn't large, but it felt alive. Street vendors called out in the mornings. Music drifted from somewhere most evenings. I took the smaller bedroom at first. Elena said there was no rush. She respected that I was adjusting. Those early months felt like I had stepped into a second life. I enrolled in Spanish classes. I learned how to navigate the metro. I helped Sophia with homework even when I barely understood the instructions. Elena and I shared grocery shopping, cooking, quiet evenings on the couch. I felt needed again. What I didn't understand yet was how fragile that feeling can be when it's built on hope instead of foundation. Looking back now, I can see the first cracks. They were small, easy to ignore, a shift in tone, a late night that wasn't fully explained, an expense that felt larger than it needed to be. But at the time, I didn't see cracks. I saw a man who had finally chosen something bold after years of being careful, and I believed, truly believed, that love alone would be enough to carry the rest. The first year in Mexico felt like something I had borrowed rather than earned. I woke up every morning to the hum of a city that never really rests. The air was thinner than Arizona, cooler in the mornings, and filled with smells I couldn't always identify. Street vendors setting up, fresh bread, exhaust from buses that looked older than I was. I would stand on the small balcony outside the apartment and tell myself I'd done something brave. Elena would already be awake most days, moving quietly through the kitchen. She liked strong coffee and music playing softly from her phone while she got ready for work. Sophia would shuffle out of her room with hair tangled from sleep, rubbing her eyes and asking what day it was, as if the answer might change something. We built routines without talking about it. I walked Sophia to school while Elena took the metro to her office. I practiced Spanish with the security guard at the school gate. He'd correct me gently, and I would nod as if I understood more than I did. I told myself I was adapting well. At first, Elena treated my presence like a gift. She would introduce me to friends as her partner from the United States. Some looked surprised. Some looked skeptical. I couldn't always read their expressions, but I could feel when conversations shifted into faster Spanish that left me behind. I tried not to let that bother me. I was the outsider. That was natural. Money wasn't discussed much in the beginning. I had my pension wired monthly and the proceeds from my house sitting in savings. Rent in Mexico City was less than what I paid in Arizona, and groceries were cheaper too. I insisted on covering most of the expenses. It felt right. I was older, more established. I didn't want Elena to feel burdened by my move. She didn't argue. In fact, she thanked me often, said she admired how responsible I was, said men her age never thought about the future the way I did. Those compliments land differently when you've spent years feeling invisible. Sophia adjusted faster than either of us. She started asking me to help with her English homework. She would sit beside me at the small dining table, her pencil tapping the paper when she got stuck. I'd explain grammar slowly, and she'd repeat the words carefully. When she got something right, she would look up at me for approval. There is something about a child's trust that reaches straight through whatever armor you think you have. By the 6th month, I was more than just Elena's partner. I was part of the daily structure of that apartment. I picked Sophia up from school if Elena was running late. I learned which neighbor to ask for help if the water pressure dropped. I even started recognizing the regulars at the corner bakery. I felt like I belonged. The first sign that something was shifting came quietly. Elena began coming home later from work. At first it was once a week, then twice. She said the company was expanding, new clients, longer meetings. I believed her because I wanted to. I told myself ambition was attractive, not suspicious. When she came home late, Sophia would wait up. I'd sit with her on the couch, reading a children's book in Spanish that I only half understood. Sometimes Sophia would fall asleep against my shoulder before Elena walked in. Elena would apologize, kiss Sophia's forehead, then disappear into the bathroom for a shower without much conversation. I asked once if everything was okay at work. She smiled and said, I worried too much. She said I wasn't used to how things moved in Mexico. She made it sound like I was naive for questioning it. After that, I asked less. Expenses began to change too. Elena needed a new phone because hers was outdated for work. Then there was a professional course she wanted to take on weekends. Then a cousin who needed help with rent for a month. None of it sounded unreasonable on its own. I transferred money when she asked, sometimes before she even finished explaining. It wasn't just generosity, it was fear. Fear that if I hesitated, I would look stingy or controlling or worse, like an old man trying to buy affection and failing. The arguments started small. One night, she told me I corrected her English too often in front of Sophia. I said I was just trying to help. She said it made her feel inferior. I apologized. Another time, she said I was too rigid about schedules, that I expected things to run like they did in the United States. I reminded her I had uprooted my entire life to be there. She said that was my choice, not her demand. That sentence stayed with me longer than I admitted. Sophia and I, meanwhile, grew closer. She began calling me from her room at night if she had a bad dream. I would sit beside her bed and rub her back until her breathing slowed. Once she asked if I would still be there when she woke up in the morning. I said yes without hesitation. There was a Saturday afternoon in Chapultepec Park when everything felt almost perfect. Elena had spread a blanket on the grass. Sophia was running in circles with other children. Elena leaned her head on my shoulder and said she was grateful I had come into her life. I remember thinking, this is it. This is the second chapter people talk about. But even that day, I noticed something in her expression when her phone buzzed. A quick glance, a slight tightening of her jaw. She stepped away to answer it. When she returned, she said it was work. I told myself not to read into it. Over time, our conversations became more transactional. Logistics, money, schedules. The warmth that once filled the apartment felt thinner, stretched. One evening, I came home from my Spanish class earlier than usual. The apartment was empty. No note, no message. I called Elena. Straight to voicemail. I called Elena. Straight to voicemail. I called again. Nothing. Sophia wasn't home either. That unsettled me more than anything. An hour later, they walked in laughing. Elena said they had gone to her sister's after school and forgot to tell me. I told her I had been worried. She rolled her eyes gently and said I needed to relax. I apologized. Looking back, I see a pattern there. Each time I felt uneasy, I swallowed it. I told myself I was older, wiser, that I shouldn't be insecure. I didn't want to become the suspicious old man who ruins his own happiness. But happiness built on silence doesn't stay solid for long. About a year and a half after I moved, Elena suggested we move to a slightly bigger apartment. She said Sophia needed more space as she grew. The rent would be higher. I hesitated for the first time. My savings weren't endless. I reminded her of that gently. She grew quiet, then distant. For weeks after that conversation, she was colder, polite but not affectionate. She slept facing the wall some nights. When I asked what was wrong, she said nothing. She said I was imagining problems. Sophia sensed the tension. Even if she didn't understand it, she clung to me more often. Sat beside me at dinner instead of between us. There's one night when Elena didn't come home at all. She texted at midnight saying she was staying with a friend because she was too tired to commute back. I stared at the message longer than necessary. I wanted to ask which friend. I wanted to demand more details. Instead, I replied, okay, be safe. The next morning, she came home smelling like perfume that wasn't hers. I noticed. I said nothing. I told myself love at 66 requires flexibility, that I couldn't expect the same intensity as a young couple, that perhaps I was misreading cultural differences. When you're afraid of losing something, you become skilled at explaining away what threatens it. Sophia turned 7 during that second year. We held a small party in the apartment. Balloons, a cake from the bakery downstairs. Elena smiled in the photos, but her eyes looked elsewhere. A week after Sophia's birthday, Elena told me she felt trapped. The word landed hard. She said she loved me but needed more freedom. She said she felt judged by her friends for being with someone so much older. She said sometimes she felt like she was living in a life chosen too quickly. I listened. I told her I had never meant to restrict her. I told her we could slow down, take space if needed. She nodded, but her expression was already distant. The morning she left for good was ordinary. She kissed Sophia on the forehead. She told me she might be late. She wore the blue blouse I had once told her made her eyes brighter. By evening, she wasn't answering her phone. By midnight, I knew something was wrong. And by the third day, when the landlord mentioned she had come by earlier in the week to remove her name from some paperwork, I began to understand that this wasn't an accident. It was a plan. What I didn't yet understand was what that plan meant for the little girl sleeping in the next room, who still believed her mother would walk through the door at any moment. And I didn't yet realize that the real test of my life wasn't moving to Mexico for love. It was what I would choose to do after love disappeared. The fourth night after Elena stopped coming home, Sophia crawled into my bed without saying a word. She didn't cry, she didn't ask questions. She just lay down facing the wall and pressed her back against my chest the way she used to when she had nightmares. I wrapped my arm around her and felt how small she still was, even at 7. That was the moment I stopped waiting for Elena to walk through the door. Up until then, I had been telling myself there was an explanation, an emergency, a misunderstanding, something that would make sense once it was said out loud. But children don't crawl into your bed like that unless something inside them already understands what the adults are still denying. The next morning, I walked Sophia to school as usual. She held my hand tighter than normal. At the gate, she turned to me and asked very calmly, "Is Mama coming back?" I didn't know how to answer. There are lies you tell to protect someone, and there are lies you tell to protect yourself. I had already used a few of both that week, but looking at her, I realized I couldn't stretch it any further. "I don't know," I said. She nodded once, as if she had expected that. When I went to Elena's workplace later that day, they told me she had resigned a week before she vanished. She had cleared out her desk quietly. No explanation given, just a formal resignation letter and a polite goodbye. I remember standing in the lobby holding the strap of my bag, feeling like the last person to be informed of something everyone else already knew. Over the next few days, pieces of the truth surfaced. A savings account she had closed, a small amount of cash missing from the apartment, a few personal items gone from her closet. It wasn't chaos, it was preparation. The police took a report, but they weren't alarmed. "She's an adult," the officer said. "She can leave if she wants." That sentence echoed in my head for weeks. She can leave if she wants. What no one seemed particularly concerned about was that she had left a child behind. Sophia continued going to school. She continued doing homework. But something in her changed. She became quieter, more watchful. When I entered her room, she looked up quickly, as if confirming I was still there. At night, she began sleeping in my room permanently. I tried calling every number I had for Elena. I sent messages that started gentle and became more desperate. No response. I even reached out to a cousin she had once mentioned. He claimed he hadn't heard from her. I considered the possibility that something terrible had happened, but the practical evidence suggested otherwise. She had planned her exit. There is a specific kind of humiliation in realizing you are not part of someone's future, even while you were funding it. My children found out within a week. I had tried to keep it vague, but my daughter could hear it in my voice. She asked directly if Elena had left. I told her yes. There was silence on the other end of the line. Then she asked the question I was avoiding. "Dad, what about the little girl?" I didn't have an answer yet. Legally, I was nothing to Sophia. Her birth certificate listed her biological father, but he had never been present. I tried the old phone number Elena had once given me for him. It was disconnected. I asked neighbors if they knew any extended family who might step in. No one did. Sophia belonged to a country that I was still learning how to navigate. The first lawyer I met with was polite but blunt. Without Elena's consent or a formal declaration of abandonment, my options were limited. Temporary guardianship was possible, but it would require documentation, court appearances, and time. Taking Sophia out of Mexico without her mother's permission was not an option. I walked home that afternoon feeling older than I had in years. My savings were shrinking faster than I expected. I had covered rent, school fees, groceries, Elena's expenses, and now legal consultations. I had assumed my pension would stretch comfortably in Mexico. I hadn't calculated the cost of uncertainty. For the first time since moving, I felt the ground shift beneath me. That evening, Sophia sat at the table coloring. She looked up and asked if we were going to move. "Why would we move?" I asked. She shrugged. "Mama moves when she is unhappy." The simplicity of that statement broke something in me. I realized I was at a crossroads. I could book a flight back to Arizona, admit to my children that they had been right to worry, and leave Sophia in the hands of social services. Or I could stay. I didn't decide that night, but I knew which option would let me sleep. The next week, I began looking for work. At 66, with limited Spanish and no local credentials, my choices were narrow. Through a neighbor in the building, I heard about a security position in a gated community nearby. 12-hour shifts, modest pay. Mostly checking IDs and lifting a barrier arm for cars. I had supervised crews back in Arizona, managed budgets, led meetings. The idea of sitting in a booth opening gates felt like a step backward, so steep it almost embarrassed me. But embarrassment doesn't feed a child. I took the job. The first morning I put on the uniform, I stood in front of the small bathroom mirror and studied myself. The fabric hung differently than the work shirts I used to wear. The badge looked temporary, like a costume. Sophia knocked on the door and asked if I was ready. When she saw me in the uniform, she smiled. "You look important," she said. I laughed, but her words steadied me more than she could have known. My shifts began at noon most days, which allowed me to walk her to school in the mornings. I'd spend the early hours reviewing paperwork for the guardianship petition, letters from the school confirming I was her primary contact, statements from neighbors who had seen me caring for her daily. The gated community where I worked was quiet, almost insulated from the chaos of the city. Large houses, clean sidewalks, residents who drove cars worth more than my old house in Arizona. I sat in a small booth with a clipboard and a button that lifted the barrier. Cars would roll up, I'd check IDs, nod, press the button. At first, the repetition made my mind drift to darker places. I would replay the last conversation I had with Elena. I would analyze every sign I ignored. I would question whether I had mistaken gratitude for love. But gradually, the booth became a place of reflection rather than regret. Sometimes Sophia would sit with me after school if my shift hadn't ended. She'd bring her homework and sit on a folding chair beside me. The residents grew used to her. Some would wave. One older woman began bringing her small pastries on Fridays. Watching Sophia do her homework in that booth, I felt something shift inside me. I had moved to Mexico chasing a feeling. Now I was staying for a responsibility the legal process called forward. Court dates were scheduled and rescheduled. Without Elena present, each step required additional proof. I learned new Spanish words I never expected to know. Custodia, abandono, tutor legal. Every document carried the same quiet reminder. I was not her father. One evening after a long shift, I came home exhausted. Sophia had set 2 plates on the table and heated leftovers the way I'd shown her. She looked proud. As we ate, she said very softly, "If Mama doesn't come back, can I stay with you forever?" There are questions children ask that have no safe answer. "I'm trying," I said. She nodded, as if that was enough for now. It has been a year since Elena disappeared. No message, no explanation, no closure. Sometimes I imagine her living somewhere else entirely, starting over the way she once promised we would. Sometimes I feel anger. Other times I feel something closer to resignation. She made her choice. Now I have to live with mine. I still think about Arizona, about the desert mornings and the quiet streets. I think about how easy it would be to return, to sit on my son's porch and tell this story like a cautionary tale. But every time I consider it, I picture Sophia's face the day she asked if she could stay with me forever. And I realize the real measure of a man at 66 isn't whether he made a mistake chasing love. It's whether he can stand by the child left behind when that love walks away. There are nights when the city feels too large for the two of us. The traffic hum never fully disappears, even after midnight. Sirens echo in the distance. Somewhere a dog barks, then another answers. I lie awake sometimes, staring at the ceiling, listening to the rhythm of a place that still doesn't completely belong to me, and I think about how strange it is that this is where my life narrowed down to a single promise. Sophia is 8 now. She has grown taller this past year, her legs stretching out of jeans faster than I can replace them. Her English is stronger. Sometimes she corrects my Spanish with a seriousness that makes me laugh. At school, she tells her friends I work in Seguridad, and she says it like it's something noble. What she doesn't know is how often I sit in that booth, wondering whether I built this entire situation out of loneliness. The guardianship process has moved forward, but slowly. I've appeared in court 3 times. Each time, I sit on a hard wooden bench, listening to proceedings I only half understand, waiting for my name to be called. The judge asks questions. The social worker asks more. They want to know why I stayed, why I didn't return to my own country, why I believe I can provide stability. I answer honestly, because she needs someone, because I gave my word. The absence of Elena hangs over every hearing. Without her signature, without a declaration from her, the court must tread carefully. They cannot assume abandonment lightly. They have to consider that she may return and contest everything. The uncertainty is what makes it heavy. My savings left dinner now. The house in Arizona feels like a story from someone else's life. I still receive my pension, but legal fees, school expenses, and the cost of living add up. I've cut my own needs down to almost nothing. I own fewer clothes than I did at 25. I don't eat out unless Sophia insists on sharing a treat from the corner stand. Pride left me quietly somewhere between the second core date and the third. At the gated community, I have become part of the background. Residents greet me with nods. Some know my name now. A few have asked about Sophia when she isn't with me. They assume I am her grandfather. I do not correct them. One afternoon, a man about my age rolled down his window and asked why I wasn't retired somewhere warmer. I smiled and said I was. He laughed and drove on. There is a particular kind of humility that comes from pressing a button to open a gate for people who will never know your story. At first, it stung. Now it steadies me. It reminds me that identity can shrink down to the simplest things. Show up. Do the work. Go home. Home is still the apartment in Navratli. We never moved to a larger place. I couldn't justify it after Elena left. The pink curtains are gone. Sophia chose new ones with small stars on them. Elena's clothes are no longer in the closet. For months, I couldn't bring myself to pack them. Eventually, I folded them into boxes and left them with a neighbor who said she would donate them. I did not leave a note. I did send a message. I stopped expecting one in return. There are moments when anger creeps in unexpectedly, when Sophia asks about her mother's favorite color, when a school form requires a mother's signature, when I realize I am learning how to braid hair from online videos because there is no one else to do it. But anger doesn't last long. It dissolves into something more complicated, a recognition that Elena, for whatever reason, chose escape over explanation. I have thought often about why I didn't see it coming. There were signs, the distance, the way she sometimes looked at her phone with an expression I couldn't read, the subtle shifts in tone when we talked about money or space. I ignored those signs because acknowledging them would have forced me to confront the possibility that I had uprooted my life for something fragile. At 66, you don't want to admit fragility. You want to believe you are making deliberate, wise decisions. Sophia has asked about going to the United States. She has seen pictures of Arizona on my phone, the wide sky, the house that is no longer mine. She asks if there are parks there, if children ride bikes the same way, if the ice cream tastes different. I tell her yes, there are parks. Yes, children ride bikes. Ice cream tastes mostly the same. What I don't tell her is how complicated it would be to get her there. Without Elena's consent, taking Sophia out of Mexico would be considered kidnapping under international law. The lawyers were clear about that. Even if I ungranted guardianship here, international travel requires additional permissions. The system moves slowly, and it does not bend easily for good intentions. Sometimes, late at night, I imagine the version of myself who never left Arizona. He wakes up in a small condo near his son. He attends church regularly. He eats dinner alone most evenings, but tells himself he prefers the quiet. He never learns the word for custody in Spanish. He never stands in a courtroom explaining why a child who does not share his blood is the most important part of his life. That version of me might have been safer, but he would also have been smaller. The day Sophia brought home a drawing labeled Mi Familia, I felt something settle inside me. The picture showed two figures holding hands, one tall, one smaller. Above them was a sun and a crooked house. There was no third figure. I asked her gently if she wanted to add her mother. She shook her head. She left, she said, not with anger, just with fact. Children accept reality faster than adults sometimes. The social worker visited our apartment last month. She checked the refrigerator. Asked Sophia questions about school. Asked me about finances. She took notes while I explained my pension, my job, my plans. After she left, Sophia asked if we were in trouble. No, I said. We're just proving we belong together. That's what this year has been, proving. Proving to a court that I am not temporary. Proving to neighbors that I am not just a foreign man who stayed too long. Proving to my own children that I didn't lose my mind entirely when I moved. My daughter is softened. She speaks to Sophia on video calls now. They talk about school and favorite foods. My son still asks if I have a timeline for returning. I tell him I don't know. There are days when exhaustion presses heavily on me. 12-hour shifts at the gate, paperwork in a language that still trips me, the constant awareness that one legal decision could change everything. But then there are evenings when Sophia sits beside me on the balcony telling me about a science project or a new friend, and I realize that my life has narrowed but deepened. I did not come to Mexico to become a father again. I came because I was afraid of fading quietly into the background of my own retirement. Now I am background to many things. To residents driving through a gate, to courtrooms that see me as a file number, to a city that has its own rhythm, but to one child, I am foreground. That is not something I expected at 66. and it is not something I can walk away from now. There's a moment every evening when I lock the booth at the gated community and step out into the street, and for a few seconds I just stand there. The air smells different depending on the season. Sometimes it carries the sweetness of roasted corn from a nearby vendor. Other times it smells like rain trapped and worn pavement. Cars move past, people hurry home. And I think about how this city no longer feels foreign in the way it once did. It feels complicated instead. Sophia meets me at the corner most days now. She is old enough to walk the short distance from school with a neighbor's daughter. When she sees me, she runs the last few steps even though she pretends she is too grown up for that kind of thing. Roberto, she says, like it's both a greeting and a reassurance. We walk home together, talking about small things. Math tests, a classmate who talks too much, a teacher who smells like strong perfume, ordinary details, the kind that make up a childhood. And sometimes in the middle of those ordinary details, she will ask something that stops me cold. Do you think Mama thinks about me? The first time she asked that, I answered too quickly. I said, of course she does. It felt like the right thing to say. But later that night, I lay awake wondering whether honesty is kinder than hope. Now when she asks, I say, I don't know what your mother thinks, but I know what I think. She looks at me, waiting. I think you are worth staying for. She doesn't always respond to that, but she leans closer when we walk. The core process is nearing some kind of decision. My lawyer says we are close to temporary guardianship. He won't solve everything. He won't allow me to take her out of the country freely, but it will give us stability here. It will make it official that I am responsible. Responsibility used to feel heavy. Now it feels like an anchor. I had another call with my son last week. He asked again whether I regret leaving the United States. He asked whether this entire chapter has been a mistake. I told him the truth. Yes, I misjudged Elena. Yes, I ignored signs. Yes, I let loneliness convince me that attention was the same as commitment. That part was a mistake. But staying was not. There is a difference between chasing love and choosing duty. I came here chasing the first. I remained because of the second. At 66, you start to understand that freedom and meaning are not the same thing. When I retired, I thought freedom was the goal, no schedule, no obligations, no one depending on me. It sounded peaceful, it was empty. Now my days are structured again. Wake up, walk Sophia to school, review paperwork, work the gate, cook dinner, help with homework, check the locks twice before bed. It is not glamorous. It is not what I imagined retirement abroad would look like, but it is full. I have thought about Elena more rarely as the months pass. When I do, it is without the sharpness that used to come. I no longer replay conversations looking for clues. I no longer draft imaginary speeches in my head about what I would say as she returned. If she walked through the door tomorrow, I do not know what I would feel. Relief, perhaps, anger, suspicion. But I also know this. The life we had before she left no longer exists. Even if she returned, something essential has changed. Sophia and I have built something separate from her. There was a school event last month where parents were invited to watch presentations. I sat in a small plastic chair in a classroom decorated with handmade posters. When Sophia stood up to speak, she glanced at me first, just for a second, to make sure I was there. That glance meant more than any romantic promise ever did. When her presentation ended, she walked straight to me, ignoring the other children running toward their mothers. She wrapped her arms around my waist and said, "Did I do good?" "You did more than good," I told her. On the walk home, she slipped her hand into mine without thinking. There are still moments of fear. I am not young. I feel my age more in the city than I did in Arizona. My knees ache after long shifts. My back stiffens in the mornings. I worry about what happens if I get sick, about what happens if something happens to me before this legal process is settled. Those thoughts visit me at night. But then I remember that no life comes with guarantees. Not the safe one in Arizona, not this complicated one in Mexico City. If you are listening to me now and you are close to my age, maybe you are thinking about your own choices. Maybe you are weighing caution against courage, stability against risk. I cannot tell you which path leads to less pain. I can tell you that loneliness can make anything look like salvation. It can make youth look like renewal. It can make attention feel like destiny. What I did not understand when I boarded that plane 2 years ago was that love is not proven by grand gestures. It is proven by who remains when things fall apart. Elena left. I stayed. And somewhere between the security booth in the courthouse, between school lunches and late night questions, I realized that the second half of my life is not about proving I am still desirable or adventurous. It is about proving I am dependable. Sophia is brushing her teeth in the bathroom as I speak these words. She hums while she does it. A small, off-key melody she makes up on the spot. In a few minutes, she will crawl into her own bed, but she will call out goodnight to make sure I answer. I always do. I do not know if we will ever live in the United States together. I do not know if the courts will grant everything I am asking for. I do not know if Elena will reappear with explanations or apologies. What I know is this. At 66, I thought I moved to Mexico for love. I was wrong. I moved because I was afraid of being unnecessary. Now, in a small apartment in a city that once intimidated me, I am necessary again. Not because I was chosen, but because I chose to stay. Last week, the judge granted temporary guardianship. It isn't permanent. It doesn't erase the past. It doesn't give me the authority to pack 2 suitcases and board a plane for Arizona tomorrow. But it is something solid, a document with my name beside hers, a recognition that for now at least, I am responsible in the eyes of the law, not just in my own heart. When we left the courthouse, Sophia squeezed my hand so tightly I thought she might cut off circulation. She didn't fully understand the legal language, but she understood the outcome. She looked up at me on the steps and said, "So I can stay with you." "Yes," I said. "You can stay." She smiled in a way I haven't seen since before her mother left. Not a cautious smile, not a testing one, just a child's relief. That night we celebrated with ice cream from the stand on the corner. She chose chocolate. I chose vanilla like I always do. We sat on a bench while the city moved around us, and for the first time in a long while, I didn't feel like I was bracing for the next blow. I felt steady. Temporary guardianship means stability here. It means I can sign school documents without hesitation. It means I am officially her caretaker. It does not mean I am her father. That word still carries a history that isn't mine to rewrite, but it means something important. It means I stayed long enough for someone to notice. I think often now about the version of myself who boarded that plane from Arizona. He believed he was stepping into a romance. He believed youth and attention would restore something he felt slipping away. He told himself he was brave. In some ways, he was naive. But I don't judge him as harshly as I used to. He was lonely. Loneliness at 66 doesn't look dramatic. It doesn't cry out loud. It sits quietly in a chair across from you at dinner. It follows you through grocery aisles. It whispers that your best days are behind you and that the rest will be repetition. When Elena called me stable, I heard needed. When she said I was different from younger men, I heard valuable. I confused being admired with being anchored. The truth is, admiration fades quickly when it is built on imbalance. I was older, I had savings, I had time. She was younger, restless, unsettled. We were not standing on the same ground, even if I pretended we were. I don't think Elena is a villain in this story. I've tried to avoid making her one in my own mind. She was 30. She had a child. She may have felt pressure, expectation, maybe even gratitude that turned into obligation. Perhaps she woke up one day and realized she had chosen security over freedom, and she left. That decision hurt. It still does when I let myself sit with it. But I no longer carry it like a wound. I carry it like a lesson. Sophia's finishing her homework at the table as I talk. She chews on the end of her pencil when she concentrates. She asks for help with English verbs and laughs when I mispronounce Spanish ones. Sometimes I watch her and think about how easily I could have walked away. The first week after Alina vanished, I considered it seriously. I imagined packing a suitcase while Sophia was at school. I imagined leaving a note with a neighbor and telling myself it wasn't my responsibility. I imagined sitting on a flight back to Phoenix convincing myself that I had done enough. But every version of that future felt smaller than the present. I have learned something in this past year that I wish I had understood earlier in life. Love is not proven by how intensely it begins. It is proven by what it survives. My marriage to Linda lasted 36 years. It survived arguments, financial strains, sickness, grief. It did not survive cancer, but it was built on shared history and equal footing. What I had with Elena was built on hope and imbalance. It was always going to require more than affection to endure. What I have with Sophia is different. It was not chosen in the beginning. It was inherited through circumstance, but it has been reinforced daily through routine, patience, and presence. Every morning, I still walk her to school. Every afternoon, I still sit in the booth and lift the gate for cars that glide past without slowing down. Every evening, we still eat dinner at the same small table, sometimes in silence, sometimes in laughter. The rhythm of it has become its own kind of peace. Do I miss the United States? Yes. I miss the desert skies stretching wide without interruption. I miss my son's porch and my daughter's kitchen. I miss the ease of understanding every word spoken around me. But I do not miss the emptiness that followed me through that house after retirement. Here, even in uncertainty, I am not empty. There's still a long road ahead. Permanent guardianship will require more hearings. International travel remains complicated. I may grow older in this city than I ever planned. My knees already remind me that time does not pause just because I wish it would. But I no longer measure my life by how closely it matches the fantasy I once chased. I measure it by whether I show up. At 66, I thought I was starting over for romance. Instead, I was given responsibility. And responsibility, I have learned, is heavier than romance, but far more durable. If you're listening to this and you are near my age, maybe you are wondering whether you have one more big leap left in you. Maybe you are thinking about selling the house, boarding a plane, chasing a promise that makes your heart beat faster. I won't tell you not to go. I will tell you this. Ask yourself whether you are running towards something solid or running away from something quiet. Ask yourself whether the person you are chasing sees you as a partner or as a solution. And if life hands you a responsibility you didn't plan for, do not measure it by how glamorous it looks from the outside. Measure it by whether you can stand in front of a child at the end of the day and say without hesitation, I'm still here. I am 66 years old. I moved to Mexico for love. I stayed because leaving would have made me smaller than the man I wanted to be. And tonight, when Sophia calls out from her room to make sure I answer, I will answer the way I always do. I'm here.